Hello everybody and welcome to our text study today. I'm Mark Davis and I'm here at St. Mark. We're studying the Gospel of Mark, and by now you know what all of this represents, so let me move on. So on Wednesday, March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, we will be discussing the last part of Mark chapter 14. So we're going to finish up this chapter. It's been a very long chapter with a lot of details of things that are going on. So our outline for today's class is we're going to begin with the hearing before the council, when Jesus is brought in before what we call the Sanhedrin Council. And that hearing is made up of what I'm going to break it down into 4 different parts. We're going to look at the judges at work there. We're going to look at the accusers. We're going to look at Jesus' words. And then we're going to pay attention to the verdict itself. So that's the hearing before the council. That will be followed by hearing about Peter's denials. You'll recall that Jesus had already told Peter that before the cock crowed twice, Peter would deny him thrice, right? So we'll hear about those denials. And then, because there's been so much detail in this chapter and the preceding chapters, we're going to walk back to chapter 11. And just kind of walk through all the stories that we've seen so far. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each story, just make sure I identify it to where you know what the story is, just so we can feel the connectivity of all of these stories. And I'll tell you why we're starting with chapter 11 again when we get there. So, for today's study, we're going to start with our reading of Mark chapter 14, verses 15 through 65. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all of the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes were assembled. Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the guards, warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many gave false testimony against him, and their testimony did not agree. Some stood up and gave false testimony against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands.' But even on this, their testimony did not agree." Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you?" That's a good question. But he was silent and did not answer. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power, and coming with the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "Why do we still need witnesses? You have heard this blasphemy. What is your decision?" And all of them condemned him as deserving death. Some began to spit on him, to blindfold him, to strike him, saying to him, "Prophesy." The guards also took him over and beat him. That ends our reading of the first portion of today's text. Long story, a lot of things going on, so let's walk through it, okay? First of all, you have the hearing before the council, and we want to look at who it is that are the council, the Sanhedrin, we call them the judges, the folks who are here. And so Mark identifies several players here. First is the high priest. Now, this word, archiereos, it's made up of a prefix, archi, which means chief or ruler, something like that. First, highest, any number of possibilities there. And ereos is a word for priest. So this is the word that just means chief priest, and it's typically translated chief priests when it's plural. So we've run across it several times already in Mark's gospel. I haven't checked this, but in my memory, I think this is the first time that we've run across it in the singular. And when it's in the singular form, it typically refers to the high priest instead of this gaggle of chief priests. So what's the difference? Well, according to tradition and some of the records and stuff, it would seem that you have these chief priests, which are kind of the hierarchy of the priestly caste, and then there's a high priest. And the high priest could perform the common duties of the priest. But here's the thing that the high priest did that nobody else did. Once a year, on the Day of Atonement, it's the high priest that would enter the Holy of Holies. That's the most sacred area of the temple structure. And there offer sacrifices for his own sin, as well as the sin of the people. And you can find in Leviticus chapter 16 some reference to that. There's reference in Hebrews chapter 9. There's some interesting stuff going on in the letter to the Hebrews about the priesthood. And the other role that this high priest singularly had was to be like the chair of the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Council. And they would gather for different types of juridical deliberations. So this was it was a religious office that was established to some extent in the scriptures, in the Old Testament. It had developed during that time. But it had become something of a political football, because in its establishment, it's supposed to be someone from the line of Aaron. You might remember when Luke tells the story of Zechariah being in the temple because it was his turn. So he wouldn't have been the high priest. He would have been, someone who's just kind of keeping the lamps burning and all of that. When he's in the temple because it's his turn, he's specifically identified as someone from the lineage of Aaron and Levi and Elizabeth from the lineage of Aaron. So this was a particularly important lineage to have. And it's supposed to be that the high priest was a part of the lineage of Aaron. But that was really changed a lot from around the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era. And you've heard the name Antiochus Epiphanes a number of times, the Seleucid leader who came in and desecrated the temple by offering a pig to the god Jupiter or Zeus there. And that's the desolating sacrifice to which Daniel and Jesus refer. Well, one thing Antiochus Epiphanes did is appointed a different high priest. And that's a controversy. If you go back and read some of the books from that era, like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, 1st and 2nd, 3rd, 4th Esdras, and so forth, you're going to see that there's a lot of struggle over who's really the legitimate high priest. And so it became a bit of a political football. And in fact, Josephus says that in between the time when Herod the Great became king of Israel. Now this is the Herod who was ruling at the time of Jesus' birth, not the one who put John the Baptist to death. That was his son, okay? So from the time Herod the Great began ruling, which I think was like about 43 before the Common Era or something, he ruled a long time. Up until the destruction of Israel in 70. During that period of 107 years, there were over 28 people who held the office of high priest. Now this was supposed to be a lifetime appointment. 28 people over 107 years, I mean, we're talking less than 4 years per high priest. And it's probably not the case that they all just kind of got into the office and were overwhelmed with the stress and died, within 4 years. Instead, what that is, it's an indicator that this office was as politically driven as it was religiously driven. And there were a whole lot of arguments at that time over whether the high priest was a legitimate high priest or not. So again, when you read the book of Hebrews and you hear a reference to the high priest in the order of Melchizedek, which takes us back to an Old Testament story, what we have is an ongoing argument, even among Jewish Christians, about who is legitimately the high priest. So this is an office established religiously that had, to some extent, probably had a lot of political overtones along the way, but had become a pretty blatantly political football. And so there's a lot of question. And when you get to the book of Acts, you know, there seems to be even more question about who is legitimately holding that office. So that's who's in charge in this meeting here, the high priest, not named, and in some gospels you'll get that Annas was the high priest and Caiaphas was his son. Other places Caiaphas sounds like he was a high priest. Mark doesn't go there, just the high priest. And also in the room then are chief priests, elders, and scribes. Now, we've seen this trilogy of identifications before. We saw it initially back in Mark chapter 8. Remember, in chapter 8 is where Jesus discloses for the first time that he's going to go to Jerusalem to suffer, die, and on the third day to be raised. He specifically names in chapter 8, verse 31, that it will be the chief priests, scribes, and Pharisees who reject him. And then, in the second disclosure, he doesn't name these groups in the second or third disclosure. But in chapter 11, you'll remember Jesus is in the temple, and it's the day after he had done the action in the temple of overturning tables and stuff, and people come to him with challenging questions. Even now, they're laying the trap to try to accuse him of some kind of blasphemy or sedition. And Mark specifically says that they were sent by the chief priests, scribes, and elders. I might have said Pharisees earlier, chief priests, scribes, and elders. And on that occasion, it was Pharisees that were sent. And so we have earlier in this chapter a mention of the chief priests, scribes, and elders. And then in chapter 15, we're going to hear again a mention of the chief priests, scribes, and elders. So 5 different times Mark mentions this trilogy of kind of working together. Whether they were a group that always worked together, whether the scribes were typically off here doing their scribal work or not, it's kind of hard to say from Mark's gospel, because it's also hard to tell how familiar Mark actually was with the inner workings of the Jerusalem power system. But Mark is clearly defining this Sanhedrin, this gathered council of chief priests, scribes, and elders, as the ones who released this verdict of Jesus. There's a lot of question, though, over whether this group actually had the power to condemn someone to death, or if this is like a pre-trial where they get together, convince themselves that this is a verdict that should be reached, and then now they have to go to Pilate and make their case, because really it's only the Roman Empire or their designee who has the power to execute or not. So a lot of times people read this anti-Semitically and just say, they killed Jesus, but they're certainly players in it, and Mark's not letting them off the hook by any means. But they're not the sole actors, and they're probably not the people with the ultimate authority to get this done. But they're building the case here. So we have the high priest, the chief priests, scribes, and elders. And then we have, as you heard, a brief mention about Peter being in the courtyard of the high priest's house. It's called palace in some places, but that word palace isn't there. Courtyard is. He's out there in the courtyard with the servants of the chief priests, which also were the group from which they put together this little ragtag mob that went and arrested Jesus in the garden in the first place. And he's warming himself by the fire. So it gives us a little sense of the time, which would be late at night. You know, both the coolness sets in and your body starts shutting down. He's following Jesus, which is what disciples are supposed to do. But Mark says definitely he's following from a distance. And he's there in the courtyard with the guards. So just imagine what's happening here is Peter's not with Jesus. He's out here with the guards, the people who arrested Jesus, and who are the gendarmes in this play going on here. Okay? So there's Jesus, there's Peter. And again, we've seen before that Mark likes to do this, right? It's a foreshadowing of what's coming up, the denials, but it's also a little bit of a sandwich, right? This is the beginning, and then we got the peanut butter and jelly, and then the denial will be the other slice of bread. So that's what we've had so far with regard to the judges, and then a little sidebar about Simon Peter. And now we also have accusers. There are people who stand up and accuse Jesus of wrongdoing. Now, this is no small thing, because originally what Mark says is they were looking for witnesses and found none. So why are we worried about witnesses? What's the big deal with witnesses? Well, you remember from the Ten Commandments that one of the prohibitions is you shall not bear false witness, right? And that's largely because in the less structured, more organic sort of judicial system that was evolving over time with all the early communities, including the Hebrew community, one of the ways that justice was done when you had a complaint against an elder, I mean, one way was that the stronger person simply overwhelmed the weaker person and got their way. So that kind of outlaw justice has always been part of the human story. But one way that it evolved into a more just system of legality and so forth was that the elders would gather around the city gates, and if you had a complaint, you would bring it there to the elders. These were supposedly, typically men, of course, who through their long life had gained wisdom, so there was a lot of reverence for the aged, that they had gained wisdom, and then collectively they would help come to a judicious decision. And that was great, and you needed a witness. And you had the threat, then you shall not bear false witness. There was a threat implied with that, because the requirement for justice is that there be truth. So you had to have witnesses who tell the truth. But human nature being what it is, the mere threat that God will be irate or that God will punish you wasn't always enough to discourage people from lying, especially if there was some way that they could work it to their benefit, right? So you could lie, yes, he sold me this property, and you could do it convincingly, and the elders might say, well, it sure sounds like you sold him this property, so it's his, right? And you could just be lying your head off. So it wasn't long before it couldn't just be one person's word against another, but you had to have at least 2 or 3 witnesses. 2 or 3 witnesses. I don't know why they didn't just say 3. I imagine at one point they tried to, and there were just too many situations. There are only 2 people actually were first-hand accountants of some sort. But 2 or 3 witnesses, that became the legal standard for determining truth. And the idea was that, especially with 3 witnesses, that it would be less likely that 3 people are willing to violate the absolute command of God and support one another and and keep their stories straight. And the likelihood of that was far lower than a single person just lying to get an advantage. And so it wasn't the idea that if 3 people say it's true, definitely it's true. It was more the idea that it's less likely that when you have 2 or 3 witnesses that there's some lying going on, because their stories could conflict or they could counter one another and so forth. So it's critical to have witnesses in a trial even today, but as the judicial systems were evolving and as they started to take on kind of religious connotation over time, particularly for the Jewish tradition, it seems that by the 1st century, the way the Sanhedrin would come to a conclusion about something so serious as warranting death is that they needed 2 or 3 witnesses. And so they tried to get it. And first, they couldn't find any. That's the first thing that Mark says. And then Mark says when they did get witnesses, they didn't agree. So when you have 2 witnesses and they conflict, you know that one of them is lying in this system. And so you don't have your 2 or 3 witnesses if there are conflicting witnesses. So in some respects, Mark is laying this out to delegitimize the Sanhedrin and their process and their conclusion. They don't have witnesses, and when they do scrounge some up, they're not viable witnesses. So already they should have let it go. But instead they entertain these witnesses, conflicting though they are, and the witnesses give an accusation. Now, Mark names the accusation, and you and I, as readers of Mark's gospel, know that it's a lie, right? So Mark's not giving any legitimation whatsoever to this process. What the witnesses say is, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will build it up. Okay, so on the one hand, Jesus did say in the 13th chapter that the temple would be destroyed, not one stone left upon another. So there was no question in Jesus' mind that the temple would be destroyed. That, however, was not really an unusual thing to believe. There were a lot of, part of the pietistic structure was that the temple in the ultimate reign of God could not be a temple built by human hands, especially by someone like Herod the Great. So it was fairly common expectation that the Messiah would end up destroying the temple and rebuilding the temple not by human hands, but rebuilding the temple by other means. And so even if Jesus said the temple will be destroyed and rebuilt, that's not particularly outstanding as some kind of theology. That there were others who felt like, well, sure, that's what needs to happen when the reign of God comes in its fullness, because the heavenly temple will not be built by human hands. What they have Jesus saying is, I will destroy the temple. And that makes him, I don't think that makes him so much a vandal as it makes him claiming himself to be Messiah and the instrument by which the temple will be destroyed and rebuilt. I think that's the point, rather than saying, oh, look how destructive this person is. He's dangerous to us and our institutions. He is dangerous to them and their institutions, but that's what the Messiah was supposed to be, dangerous to that structure of the temple. So the accusation is kind of curious. It looked like they're accusing him of vandalism. I think, in fact, they're accusing him of proclaiming himself as the Messiah through whom this gets done. And that's what will lead to the encounter Jesus has with the high priest in just a moment. So now let's turn our attention to Jesus' words, what Jesus says during this thing. So we've seen who the judges are. We've seen why there need to be witnesses and why that kind of falls apart, but what their accusation is. Now let's look at what Jesus says. First of all, Jesus' words are misquoted and contorted, as we just heard from the conflicting witnesses. The first thing that Mark says is that Jesus says nothing, that he's silent. And here's where I want you to bear with me for a minute, because I think Mark is drawing on Isaiah chapter 53 here. Some of the other Gospels even make it more explicit, and they quote a little section. But I think Mark is drawing on Isaiah chapter 53. This is from what we typically call 2nd Isaiah, and it's with reference to what we have come to call the suffering servant. Listen to what Isaiah says. In Isaiah 53, who has believed what we have heard, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? And now comes the description of the suffering servant. For he grew up before him like a young plant, like a root out of the dry ground. He had no form of majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity. And as one from whom others hide their face, he was despised. And we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. That's the silence Mark is talking about. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, like a sheep before his shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice, he was taken away. It seems to me that Mark is trying to describe this moment as a perversion of justice. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. In some ways, I think Mark is echoing this section of Isaiah 53. I don't know if Mark would be familiar enough with it to quote from it. I don't know if maybe this motif of the suffering servant shaped by Isaiah 53 as well as Psalm 22 and other places. I don't know if that was just woven into the story in every form, because it does seem like each of the Gospels in some way or another has something of this going on in their telling of the story. And I would suggest that with Mark, it's in Jesus' initial silence. He's silent against his accusers, which makes him fit this type of the suffering servant. And then finally, Jesus does speak. And it's in response to the high priest asking him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? So the high priest is not going to invoke the holy name of God. So this is a way of kind of saying, are you the Son of God? Are you the Christ? And Jesus' answer comes in two parts. Initially, he says, "I am." Now we can connect that to Exodus chapter 3, when God first names God's self as I am, or I will be whom I will be, I am whom I am, that answer. We can hear that in connection to the Gospel of John with those famous I am sayings, or we can just hear it as a very direct answer to the high priest. Are you the Christ, the Son of God? To which Jesus says, I am. If that's the case, then now we've broken with what we typically call in Mark scholarship the messianic secret. You know that I don't care for that phrase. I don't think it names it aptly, but I get what it's trying to address. It is a motif in Mark's gospel that when people go to name Jesus, he shuts them down. When demons name Jesus, he shuts them down. And when Peter answers, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," Jesus immediately tells him to say nothing to anyone. So we've got that motif going on. And this looks like, at least at this point, we're done with that. That Jesus is kind of ready to own that title. So Jesus, however, doesn't simply say, "I am," and leave it at that, right? He goes on to say, "And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming in the clouds of heaven." So let's lean into that answer for a minute and just remember where we are with that. First of all, the title Christ or Messiah and Son of the Blessed One are replaced with Son of Man. This is Jesus' preferred way of speaking about himself. And we'll circle back to that in just a moment. And then Jesus uses this language that we have already heard. We heard it back in chapter 13 of the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. Now this one's a little more expansive. Son of Man seated at the right hand of God and coming with the clouds of heaven. And I want to suggest both of those are biblical echoes. Psalm 110, verse 1. "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool." That's a really hard to fathom piece of psalmic literature, and it's the most quoted verse from the Psalms in the New Testament. And it seems that Mark is echoing that Psalm 110, verse 1. Look it up, scratch your head. That's what I always do. But also, Mark is quoting Daniel, chapter 7, verse 13, just like we heard him do back in the 13th chapter, where Jesus talked about the Son of Man coming in clouds. In Daniel, that's the heavenly response to the desolating sacrilege. In chapter 13, that's the heavenly response to the desolating sacrilege that Jesus talks about in that difficult chapter. And here, in this show trial, built on untruth, this is the answer. So I want to suggest that in some ways what's going on in that space is the desolating sacrilege. And in response, they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds. So I think it's significant that Jesus' preferred title is Son of Man, not Messiah / Christ, same word, or Son of the Blessed One, Son of God. He owns up to that title, but his preferred title is Son of Man. So let's hold that phrase Son of Man for a minute. I want to remind you of something I'm relatively sure we've said earlier, but if not, here it is. Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan say that in Mark's gospel, this title Son of Man has three aspects, okay? So the first aspect would be Jesus as the Son of Man having the authority on earth to forgive sins and heal. And we saw that early on in the second chapter when they lower this guy down into a house where Jesus is teaching, and he looks at him first thing and says, "Son, your sins are forgiven." And that's where some of the chief priests and elders accuse Jesus of blasphemy, okay? So that's one of the first ways that Jesus talks about the Son of Man as his ministry and the authority he has, and to which I think he invites others, to pronounce the forgiveness of sin, the healing, the cleansing of lepers, and so forth. That's how Jesus uses that phrase. The second aspect in which Jesus uses that phrase, according to Borg and Crossan, is when he's talking about his death. So in chapter 8, then chapters 9 and 10, when Jesus discloses that he's going to Jerusalem to suffer and die, he uses the phrase Son of Man. It kind of goes third person in that. The Son of Man with this, the Son of Man that. So that's the other aspect of being the Son of Man, is not only do you have authority to forgive and heal, but you also are destined to die. One is chained to it. It's fate for the Son of Man. And then the third way that Jesus uses the Son of Man here and in chapter 13 is from the right hand of God, coming back with clouds as kind of the ultimate answer to the desecration and the desolating sacrilege. So that there's not like a stream of linear consistency. More or less, it's like, given the context, this phrase Son of Man seems to take on one of those three aspects. There's not a lot of other ways that Jesus would use that phrase. So he's standing before the council, and it's only when the high priest asks him, remember the high priest now says, need we any more witnesses? Because he's hearing this from Jesus' mouth. The high priest asks him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And in response, Jesus says, I am. And then invokes the imagery of Daniel chapter 7, which leads us to the verdict, right? I jumped the gun on this just a second ago. The high priest tears his clothes. This is a sign we see several times in the Hebrew Bible as a sign of lament or grief or extreme, one being beside themselves, fraught with distress. The high priest tears his clothes very symbolically and says, we need no more witnesses, which I laughed when reading that, because they couldn't find a decent witness to save their lives. So now he's saying, well, it's a good thing because we don't need any witnesses, because in his mind, Jesus just firsthand has committed the sin of blasphemy. Back in chapter 2, when Jesus says to the man lowered down through the roof, your sins are forgiven, that's the accusation that the scribes offer at that time, blasphemy. In chapter 3, Jesus talks about how blasphemies can be forgiven, but anybody who blasphemes against the Holy Spirit, that's not going to be forgivable. And we sat with that several months ago when we first studied that text, that blaspheming against the Holy Spirit seems to be attributing that which God is doing to a demon or to some evil force. Jesus names blasphemy as one of those things that comes out of somebody defiling the person, as opposed to all the rules about what goes into somebody through eating and what have you that defile a person. So blasphemy is a serious charge. It's a serious charge. And it's enough for the high priest to charge Jesus here with blasphemy, because he has not denied being the Son of the Blessed One and has aligned himself with the Son of Man coming in the clouds, the Christ, the Messiah. And then the whole council condemns Jesus to death. The whole council. So it's not just the high priest. It doesn't fall just on a high priest or the chief priest, but the scribes, the elders, whoever is part of this kind of Sanhedrin council, with no idea how big it is from Mark's gospel, but they all agree. They all agree, just like all the disciples abandoned him. Just like all the disciples agreed with Peter that they would never deny him or leave him. It's this kind of group mentality that we see many, many times in Mark's gospel. They all condemn him, and then this story just goes completely off the rails because the torture begins. Now, it's not Roman soldiers beating the snot out of Jesus here. It's the council. They began to do this. They began to beat him. They began to do this. The only antecedent for they at this point is the council. So now you got the chief priests, scribes, and elders beating Jesus, putting him, saying, mocking him, prophesy, and all of that, spitting on him, which is not just gross, it's also an extreme way of insulting somebody. And And then, Mark says, and the servants joined in and hit him with the open hands also. So we often like to think it's just the brutish soldiers or maybe the troll servants, who get in on this part. But it's this distinguished council in Mark's telling that turn into this violent mob. Okay, so that's that part of the story of the hearing before the council. We've covered a lot. But we also have this part of the story of Peter's denials. Peter was below in the courtyard. One of the servant girls of the high priest came by, and when she saw Peter warming himself, she stared at him and said, "You also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth." But he denied it, saying, "I do not know or understand what you are talking about." And he went out into the forecourt. Then the cock crowed. And the servant girl, on seeing him, began again to say to the bystanders, "This man is one of them." But again, he denied it. Then after a little while, the bystanders again said to Peter, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." But he began to curse, and he swore an oath, "I do not know this man you are talking about." At that moment, the cock crowed for the second time. Then Peter remembered that Jesus had said to him, "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he broke down and wept. Now, this is obviously not Peter's finest hour, and we're not going to sit here and beat the snot out of him too much. We're not that kind of counsel. But this is rough. This is hard. This is hard to read, and it's part of the story. The first denial is to a servant girl. All we know from Mark's language is that she's young and female. She's a servant of either the high priest or one of the chief priests. Those are the folks gathered in this courtyard right now. The fact that she's a girl, the fact that she's a servant, the fact that she's young would typically mean that she's relatively harmless for someone like Peter. And there he is. She recognizes him. She points, she names, and Peter denies. The second time, she's back. She's a persistent little gal because she's right. And she starts telling people around them he's one of them. How she knows, I'm not sure. She's eyewitnessed it in some way. And again, he denies. Third time now, the bystanders, the other servants, have picked up on it and said, "Well, now, look, come on. Listen to your accent. You're a Galilean. What would a Galilean be doing here? You did this. You're with him. You're one of him, right?" And this is their proof now, is your accent gives you away. So Peter responds by, as our scripture puts it, cursing and an oath. And look, Peter is a fisherman. They can cuss a blue streak, right? I don't think the point here is that he's cussing. I think cursing is something a little different here. The Greek word there is anathematizing, which is really to cast a curse, to speak evil, to make evil happen, because words were effectual in that day and not just sounds. So he's cursing and he's swearing an oath, not something people do lightly, not something they're supposed to do at all unless they could live up to it. And so if you want to know who the other lying false witness is in this story, right here, Peter. Because on 3 occasions, he's not just denying Jesus. That's bad enough. He's lying to do it. He's now aligned with the false witnesses from earlier in the story. And then, as Mark tells the story, the cock crows. So again, we've got a bit of a Markan sandwich here. Jesus told Peter ahead of time what would happen. The cock crowed once. You would think Peter would be like, oh, crud, I'm doing it, and change his ways or leave or something. And finally, the cock crows twice, and Peter now has denied Jesus 3 times. I mean, we want to, like so many characters, we want to admire Peter a little bit for actually being there. You know, he didn't run and hide in some dark crevice of Jerusalem. But you're supposed to follow behind Jesus, not follow from a distance, sitting with the guards, lying your head off. And that's what happens. And Peter wept. Mark doesn't say he went back and threw the money back. You know, that's Judas. That's not Peter. That doesn't even happen in Mark's gospel with Judas. Peter doesn't go hang himself like Jesus does in some of the other stories. Peter wept. Whether he's still there, whether his accusers are like, oh man, it's a grown man crying, I'm out of here, I don't know. It just says Peter wept, and that's kind of end of story. So it's really not a story about Peter's danger of being kind of thrown in with Jesus, as much as Peter actually living up to what Jesus had said, that he would deny him. A grand and total failure on the part of someone often considered the chief of the apostles. That's the story Mark tells, and it stops there. All right, so that's the end of chapter 14, and let's just look through the stories. And all I'm doing here, I'm just taking the subheadings from the New Revised Standard Version that we have at our church, that we used to have in the pews, and just going to throw them up in order, and we'll walk through them so you can hear them. This was the blank template that I had used. Sorry. The first story is Jesus coming into Jerusalem. So the reason I want to go back to chapter 11 is because this is Palm Sunday, as we call it. The triumphal entry, as sometimes we call it. This is the first day of the last week. And this is when Jesus first enters into Jerusalem. So he's told in chapters 8, 9, and 10 that he's going to go to Jerusalem, be rejected, die, suffer, and on the third day rise again. Here we are. We get to Jerusalem. Starts with the entry that we often call the triumphal entry. You'll remember Jesus cursed the fig tree. Then he went back to the temple for the second time and did the action in the temple of overturning the tables and accused them of turning God's house of prayer into an emporium. Then they come back, they find the tree had withered, so this is a sandwiching of stories between the fig tree and the temple. They kind of mutually interpret each other. And then Jesus goes back into the temple, and his authority is challenged. And we're going to see this in a number of ways. Jesus tells the story of the wicked tenants. And then when the chief priests, scribes, and elders realize that Jesus is speaking against them, they start trying to lay a trap for him. So they ask a question about taxes. Are you seditious or are you blasphemous? They're trying to catch him in one of those two things. The Sadducees ask the question about the resurrection to try to get him to go against tradition and lose the appeal to the crowd. Someone that seems to be maybe speaking from a genuine heart, or at least doesn't seem to be outwardly laying a trap, asks about the greatest command. And they have a pretty decent conversation about that. And then Jesus raises the question, why do the scribes say that the Messiah will be David's son, and challenges that the Messiah would be secondary to the reign of David. After that, Jesus starts critiquing the scribes, blatantly critiquing them. They impoverish widows. They devour their houses. They're misusing their power. Then we have a story of a widow who's giving the last bit of her coinage. She's contributing to that system that oppresses her. That's her tragic situation. And that leads us to the temple. When Jesus and the disciples are looking at it, remember one of them says, look at the big stones and large buildings. And Jesus said, this place is toast. And they're like, well, when is that going to happen? And he begins to talk about the temple. He talks about the coming persecutions that they will face, which sounds like Mark speaking to his own community about the struggles that they face. Jesus then appealed to this language from Daniel chapter 7 and following of the desolating sacrilege and the Son of Man coming in the clouds. So this is the answer to the desolating sacrilege. And then Jesus appeals to a different fig tree, not the withered one over there, but the lesson of the fig tree is when you see the leaves coming, you know spring is here. So learn the lesson. Look for the signs. You have to watch. Keep your eyes open, Jesus is saying to the disciples, and I would suggest Mark is saying to his community. And that ends that difficult chapter 13, and now we're in chapter 14. That starts with Judas agreeing to betray Jesus. The unnamed woman anointing Jesus' head at Bethany, and you're supposed to be telling her story. We're supposed to be telling her story. How's that going for you? And then Jesus has Passover with the disciples. He institutes then the Lord's Supper by associating bread and the wine with his body and his blood. Then tells Peter, after saying, all of you will abandon me, one of you will betray me. Peter's like, I would never do that. That's when Peter's told he would deny Jesus 3 times. Then Jesus goes and prays in the garden. We looked at that last week, that heartbreaking prayer with all of the different aspects of it. After which Jesus is betrayed and arrested. Then he's brought before this kangaroo court council that we read today, and Peter denies Jesus. That's where we've been over the last few days, starting on Sunday. Now we're at the night of Thursday, and chapter 15 is going to take us into what we call Good Friday. So I'm looking forward to our discussion. That's all for now. Thanks. Bye.